Okay. Thank you. Hear you. All right.
And now for something completely different.
We're going in a completely different direction. and maybe provoke you into a fit of fury. It's a possibility.
With luck?
With luck. John Carlin, many of you in the room remember him from 4 years ago at Africa in the World, when he presented a documentary on Rwanda. John is a writer, is a filmmaker, is a documentary maker, is a food critic, raconteur, is a man about town. And perhaps...
And most important, an old friend of Dele Olojede.
We used to live on the same streets in Johannesburg when we were both covering the transition from apartheid, and quite by accident, lived on the same streets, and so we decided we'll play golf, squash together.
Don't mention the word golf. This morning it was...
I am toilet trained now, no mention of golf.
No mention of golf.
There are many enemies, John. And perhaps more relevantly for a significantly South African audience is that John is the author of Playing the Enemy, the book that became Invictus, in which Morgan Freeman acted as Mandela. Clint Eastwood was the director, I believe. Matt Damon, you know the movie. A few months ago, John asked me, or maybe I volunteered, to look over the manuscript of his memoirs. The manuscript, the book, is provisionally titled Luck. And as I read this manuscript to offer him suggestions about what direction it should go, it occurred to me that this is actually a potentially powerful, relevant conversation for us to have at Africa in the World, because in a room full of overachievers, which is probably the singular reason you were invited here to start with, perhaps it bears reminding that you are not all that. And so, John, in that manuscript, a certain quote by a Monsieur Piot jumped out at me, in which he says, the absence of bad luck in life is the most important thing. What do you understand by that?
Okay. Let's just take that quote as a starting point. The reason I did something as outrageously presumptuous as to write my memoirs, I mean, I really feel, embarrassed to actually, who the hell am I to be doing my memoirs?
Well, not so embarrassed that you didn't do it.
No, but I'm going to explain why I did it. I did it as an exercise in self-therapy. In fact, I'm not even sure I actually want to publish the damn thing, but that's another story. But the thing is, it was during the COVID lockdown, I needed something to give a little bit of sort of structure and purpose to my confined life. And I thought, well, why don't I write my little memoirs? And also, being confined and locked down, it made me think a bit more about my life and how I'd come to this point. And of course, with the sort of, the shadow of the valley of death during COVID, you sort of also start thinking about how we got here and how long we're going to be around. So the one thing, the thing that just struck me, the more and more I delve back into my own little life, is just how absolutely the predominant driver of my life has been luck. And one likes to think that, yes, one is terribly disciplined and intelligent and driven and ambitious, and you deserve all the success that you have, all these overachievers here that we're talking about. I don't believe in deserve at all. I think that it's luck overwhelmingly. Then sure, you get your luck and you seize it, and you either seize it or you don't, and you capitalize it or you don't. But to get back to COVID, I remember I put into the Google search engine lessons from COVID, and something like 1.3 billion articles came up. Now, I will not claim to have read them all. However, what I saw, as a general trend, I just saw how little the lessons that were drawn included the centrality of luck in life. And there's this book by this guy, Fareed Zakaria, the CNN guy, who wrote a book, 10 Lessons from a Post-COVID, what have you. So I just bought it on Kindle simply to see whether he alluded to luck at all from his 10 lessons. And I did a search, and I saw that he used the word luck twice, and it was purely as a manner of speaking, like as luck would have it or whatever. When overwhelmingly, if you think about COVID, I mean, luck was just, as in just about everything else in life, but let's just talk about COVID. So it so happened that one day, a test tube happened to break and fall in a lab in Wuhan, or a little beastie jumped from a wild animal to a human in a market in Wuhan.
Pangolins.
Yeah, exactly, the pangolins, God bless them. And, and then, from there they got onto a plane. I think the first we had in Europe, anyway, someone went to Italy, they went to the Alps skiing, and then it sort of, spread across to California and all over Africa and all the rest of it. And then there was a question of, the sheer luck of whether you actually caught it or not. I haven't caught it, which is amazing, given I've been massively exposed to it, thanks to my dearly beloved son. And then whether you could or not, how badly you responded, whether you died or it just felt like a bit like a common cold. Again, these were luck things to do with the genes that come with your baggage in life. And so it just, the overwhelming lesson from me of COVID is that. And then just to finish, just to come back to your point, Dele, it was in February, just before the whole thing really spread, and it was coming. We all knew the pandemic was coming. There was an interview in the Financial Times with a virologist called Peter Piot, who's the great virologist of the world, who's written 500 academic papers, 16 books. And he was talking scientifically, seriously, how we're going to deal with this pandemic. And then he came up with this quote. He said, yes, but, all very well, everything I've said, scientific, medical, whatever, but the most important thing in life is the absence of bad luck.
And you remember the woman who had done everything correctly, right? I mean, Tell us that story.
I mean, it's a terrible little story because, unfortunately, I'm going to find it impossible to avoid laughing, but because it's also tragic. There was a story. During the COVID, there was a woman in England who had pre-existing conditions. Remember, we talked about pre-existing conditions, which made you more vulnerable. So she had been locked up inside a house without leaving, an elderly lady, for 9 months. And the first day she came out of her house, she crossed the road and she was run over by a bus and killed. So, laugh, cry, whatever. But there you go.
So, but there is also a way of looking at this because of your own story, your own backstory. Your father flew with the RAF, the Royal Air Force, during World War II, as your little island was under bombardment by the Germans. Tell us the singular statistic that characterizes service in the RAF.
Well, I think the important point about my father, the most significant thing in my father's life is that he gave birth to me, of course. No, but my point is that, and I dwell on it at some point at the beginning of the book, as Dele knows very well, just the sheer unlikelihood of one being born. In fact, there's a movie that's just come out by Woody Allen called Coup de Chance. It's a French, stroke of luck, in which he talks precisely about this, about how actually being born at all is winning a sort of lottery. And, just to share, just consider each of you, just pause and reflect a minute, how your parents met and, the chances of them meeting, and I don't know, in some cases maybe they were in the same town or the same village, but in my case, it was a particularly extremely unlikely business, me being born. Because my father, well, first of all, he survived the Spanish flu as an infant in 1918 when he was born, which was infinitely worse. Not infinitely worse, but about 10 times more victims than COVID. And it affected everybody equally, whether you are young or old. Then he fought in the Second World War in the RAF. The average in the RAF for dying, average number of missions, of flights, was 30. And after 30, you were almost certainly going to die. My father flew in 97, and he was shot down twice, one into the Mediterranean Sea and one on land. And then, after the war, he got married I discovered this only much later in life, that's another whole story, to this Scottish, my father was from Glasgow, this is sort of Glasgow sweetheart who'd been waiting for him. And then in 1953, 8 years after the war, they went on a ferry crossing from Glasgow across to Northern Ireland, and the ship sank in the middle of the Irish Sea. And about 170 people died and about 20 survived. His wife, his sister-in-law, mother-in-law all drowned, and my father survived it. And then there was a commission of inquiry afterwards in a court in Glasgow, and my father, I've seen the newspaper clippings from the Glasgow Herald, he said, I have no right to be alive. Ergo, I have no right to have been born. And then and on the other hand, my mother, she's Spanish. She lived through the Spanish Civil War, which is a very bloody business, and she survived that. And then she fetched up in 1954 or 5 in London. In those days, Spanish girls, young girls, didn't go to London like they do now. She also came from a very conservative Catholic family, so it would have been pretty frowned upon. Why did my mother go to London, where she, by some amazing chance, met my father? Because her older sister, my Aunt Albia, married a Brit during the Spanish Civil War in Segovia Cathedral. They got married, they immediately had 2 babies. Second World War broke out. My aunt's husband enlisted in the Royal Air Force and was killed in the very first flight he went on, leaving my Spanish aunt in London under the Blitz and all the rest of it with these 2 little babies. And so why did my mother go to London? Because to go and help out and accompany her older sister. So had her husband not been shot dead, shot and killed in his first flight he went to the Second World War, had he survived, then again, I wouldn't have been born either for that. And there's so many, and then the sheer fact of them.
So many people had to die in order for you to exist.
Exactly. Yes. Including. So I'd better make the bloody best of it, hadn't I? Really? All these people have died for me to be born. Jesus. Anyway, what I'm saying, my stories may be a little bit more extreme than others, but nevertheless, I think the same principle applies, the sheer unlikelihood of people being born at all. So I'm just laying my foundations for my sort of luck argument, and I see it all through my life. I have been quite successful in the little world that I inhabit, and sometimes people come up to me and they, very regularly, but they will congratulate me on, having done this or that or the other. And I always have a certain sense of imposter syndrome when people say this. I welcome the thought, the flattery, but I know, and the reason why I think I have that sense of it is because I know that so much of it has got so little to do with my own free will and my own hard
That's
work.
very interesting for me because, 20 years ago, whatever, when I won the Pulitzer Prize, and a lot of people now say, how your obituary is going to be written now, and so on. You're such a genius. The World Bank called me to come and talk to their board about what direction they should be going in the world. Me. Yeah? But I tell people after the initial euphoria subsided that do you realize how lucky I was to have won? Now, of course, I was a reasonably talented reporter and writer.
Reasonably diligent too.
Reasonably diligent in my work and so on. However, think about this. I won the Pulitzer Prize for international reporting for coverage of the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide. But think about it this way. This was a story examining, with the benefit of hindsight, how Rwanda could have happened and what the costs of that were to get a society to rise from the ashes. Now, if that had been the year of the Arab Spring or Tiananmen Square or any number of big global events, the best work from those would have won the year that I won. So my luck was that, apart from diligence and a reasonable level of talent and all the usual things, was that the world was quiet that year. And therefore, they handed this to me, and then I became a genius, and I was going to talk to the World Bank.
No, so the world was quiet, so there was scope for something reflective, analytical, whatever. But I mean, but going back even before then, I mean, there you were. You were telling the story yesterday with Richard Joseph.
Yes, with Richard, who is here somewhere.
Who's here?
Yes.
You know, after your editor was killed.
Yes.
You know, maybe he wouldn't have been killed. He could have survived it, and then maybe, you know, circumstances could have made it quite simple, just for things that you had no control over.
Right.
You might have stayed in Nigeria.
The most dramatic example of that was simply the time that I was born, not just the place that I was born in. Because if you were born in Nigeria, particularly pretty much any part of Nigeria around the time of independence, say 1960, you didn't understand how lucky you were to have been born at that time, and not 10 years later, when you've already had the Biafra War and so on. So the result of that was that I grew up in a place in which I was born, a community I was born to, a university town, where every single person there was invested as a matter of automatic assumption in my success in life and in my flourishing, and in the public education system created. And it also so happens that a young, dashing professor called Wole Soyinka had just taken over the Department of Dramatic Arts at the University of my hometown, and he was surrounded by other dashing playwrights and poets, J.P. Clark and so on. And before their plays went out on the road, they were tested at the local theater, to which we school kids had free entry on Sunday afternoons. So my interest in literature and art and the inspiration to pursue a certain kind of life was a direct result of being born at a particular place to a particular family where my dad did not, for some weird reason that we don't fully understand, he did not believe in segregating his daughters from his sons, and so my eldest born sister was sent to England for her proper education, which then set an example for everybody else. So you were born into a place where you had no control of the timing or where you were going to be born into. So if you were born 10 years later in Nigeria, your luck had begun to evaporate. Not completely, but it had begun to. Right? And if you were born 2 decades later, then you probably didn't even have any experience that thinks of how properly things could be run. Yeah. So this is what the resonance from reading your book had for me.
Well, that's exactly what I hope that my book does. It precisely will make people think about their own lives in those terms. And the thing is that you talk about the right time, but my God, that it was also the right place and the right family.
Right.
You know, right. I mean, there's probably, I don't know, how many children would have been born in Nigeria the day you were born? Lots. And there's probably quite a few of them that had quite a similar DNA makeup to you, the same magnificent good looks, the same extraordinarily sort of genetic advantages, but they happened to have been born, even if it was on the same day at the right time, in some little village somewhere where they didn't know about books and parents who encouraged them. And, you know, and this goes across the board. And it's one reason why, just making a bit of a leap forward in my life to when I went to live in America, one thing I really, really don't like about America is the prevalence of the insult, you loser, to people. Here in South Africa, English-speaking people, or in Britain, or in whatever, in Australia, you don't have loser as this ubiquitous term with which you dismiss people. And the whole idea of loser is predicated on the kind of Protestant work ethic idea that if you are a winner, it's because you deserve it, because you were diligent, because you worked
bootstraps
hard.
and all that.
All that stuff.
Okay, we'll come back to that, but do not jump the gun.
Well, I'm not jumping the gun because my point I'm making is that so much has got to do with, you know, with the accident of birth.
As the shepherd. Okay. Let's talk about football and the idea of luck.
Sure.
You used to be a loyal Manchester United fan until you betrayed us at some point in your life. But that's not the particular subject. That's not the point. What role does luck play in football as a reflection of life itself?
Exactly. Well, I mean, this book that I've written, which may or may not see the light of day, it may just end up that Dele is the only person who reads it apart from me. But, you know, that's something. It's a book which I talk about my own life and my parents, and I talk about my my work and my loves and my football. And football is a thread that runs through it, because in my generally sort of wandering life, changeable life, the one constant has been football, if not Manchester United. But football is by far the biggest sport in the world, not only in terms of how much it's played, but also in terms of how much it's watched. It's probably, I would say, almost without any kind of anxiety of being questioned on this really seriously, it's probably the world's leading subject of conversation, beyond domestic matters, what food are we going to buy today, or let's look after the children. I mean, people are infinitely more erudite, literate, informed, analytical on football than they are on politics, however much we may be fascinated by it among this august, set of people here. And I contend that a very large reason why football is the most popular sport in the world and the great subject of conversation is that it is the sport that most mirrors life. In the sense that football, more than any other sport that I know, outcomes are more dependent on luck than in any other sport. In football, those of you who take an interest in this, you will all immediately nod when I say this.
A large number of people here, otherwise we made a mistake.
Yeah, well, let us hope. I mean, certainly women have no longer got any excuse not to know about football. This has changed. So, anyway, but there is no other sport that I'm aware of that after a game, people more often discuss whether the result was fair or not. You talk about it immediately. Sometimes you can talk about it for years, for decades. The Germans are still lamenting the fact that they lost the 1966 World Cup against England, and they're quite rightly too. But so the whole debate as to was it a fair result given what happened, you don't have that conversation after a rugby match, or not very much. You don't have it in basketball, you don't have it in tennis, but in football you do, because in football the random plays a far bigger role. To give but one example, it's the only sport that I know where you can actually score against your own side. And the power the referee has, this, is supposedly a godlike arbiter, but actually is another flawed human. The power the referee or the linesman could have over the outcomes is yet another sort of metaphor for the randomness of life.
And tell me about the resentments of decades of the Argentinian footballer from the 1966 World Cup.
Yeah. Okay.
Not 86. It was 1966
66.
when the referee ruled that the ball had crossed the line for a goal for England.
Okay. Well, let's talk about, you're mixing it up as you talk about the Argentine player. The Argentine captain was sent off against England in the quarterfinal.
Yeah, he was sent off.
And so, as a consequence of which, England played against 10 men most of the game and they won it, and the Argentines have been full of resentment and loathing ever since.
Might even have had something to do with the Falklands War.
You took the words out of my mouth. I mean, I know Argentina extremely well. I lived there a large part of my life, and there's no question that the sending off of the Argentine captain in '66 was a contributing factor to the Falklands War, for Christ's sake. You laugh, it's true. But the other thing is, England, poor England, it's such a sort of fading little power. It's just every day it seems to decline further. Poor old Queen Elizabeth had to sort of watch, the beginning of this magnificent empire when she ruled, most of you people here, and then it all just went away. And now they just sort of drift. They're now drifting off into the North Atlantic into total irrelevance. And so this sad little nation, whose really only great success until '66, or since that whole period, was the Second World War, where they did pretty well. But actually, winning the World Cup in 1966 is the only real
crowning achievement.
Yeah, and they go back to it again and again and again. I mean, and you hear this whenever England have played Germany at football since the final was England-Germany. You have the pitiful, nostalgic sort of post-imperialist English. This song that they sing at the German fans tauntingly. 2 world wars and 1 World Cup, they sing. The fact they've lost every other bloody game against Germany is completely by the by. But the point is that this supreme moment of pride, which binds together this once great nation, winning the World Cup in '66, is based on a massive fraudulence. I mean, some of you may recall, they were 2-2 after 19 minutes, they went into extra time, and Jeff Hurst, the England player, shot the ball, and it bounced off the top of the crossbar and came down. And no one in the stadium saw whether it crossed the line or not. No one who's seen it 1,000 million times on TV afterwards is sure whether the ball crossed the line, except for the Russian linesman who was there, who he clearly saw that it had gone over the line and decided that it was a goal for England. And that was the critical thing. And of course, had it not been a Russian linesman, see, in those days, the Russians, we're talking only 20 years, 21 years after the end of the Second World War, who's the Russian linesman going to go for? The Germans or the... and in fact, this Russian linesman, I checked him out, he then afterwards, he actually wrote a book in which he claimed that the ball had not only crossed the line, it actually gone to the back of the net, which is insane. It was insane.
You can actually check this out on YouTube. It did not cross the line.
So the greatest moment, the most glorious moment in the last 70 years of this once mighty nation was all turned on this absolute random element that, had it been probably, for example, a Latin American linesman, might have been more sympathetic, like Paraguay under the dictator Stroessner,
yes.
Housing all these sort of German war criminals. I mean, let's give it to the Germans. Let's get across the line. Anyway,
I want to shift this slightly, John. And yet, despite what seems to be the obvious centrality to what our lives become, we've been ingrained with the idea that we are the masters of our own fate and we are responsible for our success and we deserve it and so on. And of course, there is also the meritocracy trap, I think one writer in America has described it as, which leads us to believe that everything that happens to an individual depends largely on their sheer effort, day by day. Now, what if we truly shift our thinking to see the reality of luck? I mean, in my case, I would say it's like 95%, right? That I'm here is dependent on luck. And when people, World Bank board, can you imagine? I was just
talk of imposter syndrome.
And I had nothing. I had no idea about finance. I mean, if it had been Chris Varela, I would say, okay, maybe there is some basis to it. But he's Greek American. They shouldn't have trusted him either.
No.
But what it means is that if we shift our thinking and accept that luck is predominant in what becomes of our lives, how does that affect our relationship with other people?
Exactly. That, for me, is the valid point. I mean, it's all very well going on about luck being the predominant thing. And let me just say one thing very quickly before I answer your question. I'm very skeptical, as a rule, of these self-help books that give you the sort of step-by-step guide to being a success in work, in love, in this or the other, because, I mean, there are just so many...
The loved ones don't work. We have empirical evidence.
Sure. I mean, exactly. How to have great sex, all that stuff. I mean, it's all just complete bullshit. Now, but there was a fantastic self-help book, really seminal self-help book written 500 years ago called The Prince by Machiavelli, which is the kind of definitive book on leadership with step-by-step advice.
How to maintain power, how to get rid of your enemies.
Exactly. It's better to be feared than to be loved.
That's right.
All that good stuff. But despite the fact that it gives you this incredibly detailed book on how to control people, how to exercise and keep power about control, you read that book, The Prince, and at a certain point he says, but you know what? It's like he's blowing a great big fart under everything he's written. And he says, but actually, it's all half and half. Half of it all is down to fortune, to good luck.
So he's settled for 50%.
So he's the ultimate manipulator, how he controls things. Even he sees it. And I think I would tend more towards your 95%. I think 50% is definitely on the low
side.
Low end. But anyway, sorry, but to answer your question, yes. Well, I think that, you see, the reason why I go on about giving all these examples and try to batter people into submission and accepting that, luck is the predominant driver, is that if you actually do absorb that, what I consider to be a huge truth, then it should follow that as night follows day, or as day follows night, that you will be a kinder human being. And so I'm saying the two big things in life are luck as the driver of our destinies, of our lives, and kindness as the single most important virtue in humanity. And the reason why I think one leads to another is that if you understand that this other person, for example, with whom you may have a conflict, with whom you may have a political difference, or with whom you may have had some smaller row, if you understand that so much of what that person's thinking and the makeup of that person is down to circumstances over which they have no control, then you will be more inclined to kindness, more inclined not to judge, not to condemn, to try and understand, because you're in the same boat too. So to limit it to the area of politics, we seem to act and think in our political analysis, and God knows I've done it too, as if people pick their teams. People do not pick their teams any more than the political parties, any more than they pick their football teams.
Or their religions.
Or their religions, precisely. But let's just leave it to political parties for now. But religion, exactly the same thing. The circumstances give you this. You're right wing or left wing because your parents or because someone at school or something happened or you saw something when you're at a certain age and you go with that team. And then, of course, what we all do is the old confirmation bias. Once we've picked our team, we then select our evidence to support it, and we discard all that doesn't. And then we get to where we are now, this highly polarized world. And so my point is that if one understands that, if one has the sensibility and the logical thinking to act consequently on that perception of the randomness of how it came about to do this, then I'm not saying you're not going to disagree with a guy who supports Donald Trump. But what it should do is reduce the heat, reduce the violent feelings, and make you more comprehending. And I think the thing about polarization is that inevitably we're going to be polarized. We're going to have different views on this, that, and the other. Believe in God, don't believe in God, believe in Trumpism, believe in this. But the problem is when the whole thing becomes heated and violent. And so if you just bring down that level of heat and so agree to disagree, and I think that idea of agreeing to disagree can also flow from an absorption of luck. And in contrast to religion, which ordains it from heaven, I'm giving you a sort of ground-up logic for behaving in that way.
Thank you. So I have another proposition for you, which is that where do you, if we follow what's just described, to be kind, and I think there is probably very few people in this room who do not believe in the...
And to try and understand and not to judge.
And not to judge too harshly. Now, most people would agree with that, because we are reasonable people. As it says in The Godfather, what manner of men are we if we cannot reason? Right? What manner of people?
Godfather, one of Dele's sacred texts, The Godfather.
Everything you need to know in life is contained in The Godfather. If we take that proposition to a very far extent, to not judge harshly, to try to understand, to be more kind and gentle, does that then mean we shouldn't have certain red lines?
Exactly.
And what are those red lines that pop up in your head?
No, that's right. I mean, it doesn't mean, the danger with the line I'm following is that you then absolve everyone of all sin and punishment and all that.
God knows I need the absolving.
God knows you need a Dele, but we'll talk about it over a drink later, not in front of all these people. The thing is, I mean, I think there has to be a red line, as you say. There has to be a point beyond which, and I think that, in terms of, let's say, evil, you can maybe explain it why someone turns out a certain way. But I would say that it's when you're talking about people, or for that matter, political movements that are systematically, inhuman, remorselessly so. I think at that point, so we were talking at breakfast earlier, I did a book, this could be a bit contentious what I'm going to say now, but we like contentious, don't we, so that's fine. I did a book about...
You're safe here.
I did a book about Oscar Pistorius, and I really got stuck into it. I went to every day of the trial, and I spent quite a lot of time with him and his family, and I also saw the families of the victim, poor old Reva Steenkamp. Now, I think on the one hand you've got Pistorius, and on the other hand you've got Vladimir Putin. I mean, Pistorius had this moment of madness. We don't know, no one knows, probably even he doesn't know what the hell it was that caused that moment of 3 seconds when he fired those bullets and that poor woman was killed. But his life was not systematically bad, unkind, inhuman. In fact, really quite the opposite if you look at it closely, as I have done. But then you've got some, and God knows the guys felt remorse. I was in court. I have never seen such scenes of despair and penitence, and as I've seen with this guy, it was like sort of King Lear when he's holding Cordelia at the end of the play. I mean, it was just sort of powerful stuff. And unless he's a fantastic Oscar-winning actor, forgive me, I think it was for real. I mean, so that's one thing, and I think someone like that, I'm not saying that they shouldn't be sent to jail or what have you, because, you have to set some kind of an example to society, but I don't think that he should be condemned in the same way that Vladimir Putin, who's been systematically killing, poisoning people for years and years and years and years now. And, or for that matter, of course, at the risk of raising another delicate subject, Mangosuthu Buthelezi. But we can discuss that some other time.
We shall traipse away from that for the moment.
Gingerly, as you said, yes, gingerly walk away. But I think that there, generally speaking, is a kind of a red line, a distinction, a point beyond which, the understanding has got to give way to judging and indeed condemning.
Yeah, correct. So a good example, of course, would also be the Catholic Church's protection of pedophilia, systematically and institutionally. You were traipsing away gingerly from Buthelezi, but they keep yanking me back.
You're going straight back into the fire. Straight back into the fires of hell, Dele.
Okay, so we will move away from that. If you accept, then, you sounded very persuasive to me. In fact, we agree on the subject. But perhaps there are people in the audience who do not agree. I would like to hear why. And so I will prioritize those who disagree first, and then we can take anybody else. Chris, is this a violent disagreement? Or... Okay.
Where are you from?
That's a below the belt.
I love it.
Grace, please go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate the more you believe in luck, the more kind you will be. But I also question whether that's good for your motivation, for your belief in free will. Like, what is your view as to what it would do to your desire to have impact in the world?
Okay. I'm not saying that one should be, in King Lear's phrase, the natural fool of fortune, and just sort of drift along through life and sort of wait for things to happen. But I'm not saying that luck is everything. I'm saying it's the predominant thing. And luck brings things your way, or absence of bad luck, good luck. And then, of course, when it comes, you have to seize it and act on it. If you want, if you want to have a sort of happy, cheerful, successful, for that matter, making enough money to feed yourself and your family. So I'm not saying that you're going to just be sort of there drifting, lying on a sort of waterbed on a pool waiting for something to happen, a lightning to strike or not. But obviously you have to seize the opportunity. But what you can't do is this American thing of saying, you loser, which is so horrible. I hated that about when I lived in America. Because the thing is, that loser is some guy who happened to be born into some family which had, problems in that family.
But those biggest losers are also the most motivated. And we have a book coming out tomorrow by Walter Isaacson on Elon Musk, South African. Yeah, sure. And one of Walter's biggest arguments is these creators were made to feel as losers when they were young.
I know that book. I know about that. There are a significant number of very high achievers came from screwed up families. Right. But the fact is, most people in screwed up families do not end up being Einstein.
Okay. All right. Yes. Can you give the paper?
Thank you both very much for a very entertaining discussion. And I have no doubt that both of you have huge reservoirs of talent. But I do want to ask you whether luck is not a metaphor for the meritocracy argument. Because if you look at South Africa, for instance, the intergenerational inequality, there's research done that shows that if you're born in the poorest 2 quintiles, and your parents are in the poorest 2 quintiles, the chances of the children being poor are about 95%. Same with the 10th percentile. It also happens in the United States. There are economists here who will know better than me, but there was that one of Barack Obama's advisors developed the Great Gatsby curve to explain that inequality in the United States is replicated by whom your parents are. So luck is cool, but you've got to be born into a position in terms of which quintile your parents are in to take advantage of that luck. So unless we address the intergenerational inequality, you don't give a lot of other people in the society a chance at also being lucky.
Okay, thank you.
Couldn't agree more.
All right. Now, so one of the things I think that, one has been all over the world covering all these crazy places, and I would suggest that if you were born into Syria 15 years ago, and you were born in even Moldova, your chances in Moldova, I will bet on the Moldovan. It's not a complete correlation, but if you're just looking at the broad averages, if you're born into Syria, you're pretty screwed, right? And so you didn't ask to be born in Syria. And so the idea of this argument about the centrality of luck, I think, if you look at it in big, broad ways like that, becomes less indefensible. But I would still like to hear more from people who find other arguments more persuasive. Anyone? Yeah? Yes.
Thanks. So there was a book I read many years ago by Michael Mauboussin, and it's called The Success Equation. And he had a nice definition that I really liked. It says, luck is what is left, where is the residual that is left once you deduct skill from the outcome. And I think it's a good definition because luck can lead you to places where it starts to look like caprice. And just to use a very random example, I won't name the country, but there was a report after an earthquake in a country many years ago, and one of the things that came out of it was people took the attitude that if it happens, maybe God is angry. If it doesn't happen, God is not angry. And they rejected or refused a lot of help that was given to them to build reinforcements in their homes, because they just felt an earthquake is something that is capricious. We can't do anything about it. But you see, there are places in the world today where earthquakes happen and nobody dies. So it can lead you to a place where luck and caprice start to look almost like the same thing, whereby, and if you start to feel like, I think, just to round up my point, the main thing here is not to say luck is the majority or is the overriding theme. I think a better approach would be to say, let's deduct everything else. And then whatever we have left is luck. Sometimes it might be 10%, sometimes it might be 90%. And to use the football example, the amount of stuff that goes into football. I mean, you saw, I don't know if anybody saw it just a few days ago, where Erling Haaland says he tapes his mouth when he sleeps at night to improve his breathing from the nose, because that can improve his performance by some 0.05%. So people put in all this effort, and then when he gets on the pitch, obviously luck still plays. He can take a shot, he hits someone's leg, deflects and goes in. But to get to that point, you probably have to deduct a lot of other factors, just so people don't think that they don't have a say over the matter.
Well, no, I'm not saying you don't have a say, but I'm saying that, you talk about Erling Haaland as the great Norwegian sort of robot goal scorer. You know, his father happened to be a footballer too, so he started off with those genes. So, you know, right there we had you know, a large part of the deal settled. But I think one thing I'd like to say too is in terms of the fates of nations. One thing that we were talking about here on our first night of that dinner was about the need to get the best and brightest leaders. And if you get the best and brightest, you will improve your chances. There's no guarantee either, but you will definitely improve your chances. Now, just consider, and so therefore, if we're talking about best and brightest leaders and the need for them to enter public service, then presumably we're all more or less agreeing on the importance of leadership, and we're not subscribing to the idea that everything that happens in the world is down to the faceless forces of economics. So, have a look at Nelson Mandela, for example, who was someone of tremendous importance in this country. You know, they call George Washington the indispensable man in America. He was the indispensable man here in terms of the transition to, I don't think that what was achieved here would have been sold to the white powers that be by anyone else but Mandela. He was the great salesman of democracy in this country. He was, you know, for all kinds of reasons that we know, he was a great leader. Now, just reflect for a minute. Go back in Mandela's life. When he was about 20 years old, he was down in his little village of Kunu.
He was a teenager, I think. Was it like 19?
Yeah, 19, 20. He was down in Kunu, a little village in the Transkei. He was part of the kind of royal family. I've been down there. You know, it wasn't Buckingham Palace, believe me. But he was there, and he was, and the chief said, "You've got to marry this particular girl." Now, the fact is, Mandela, he was being put into a forced marriage. You know, we all think it's always one way. In this case, they were trying to force him into this marriage, and Mandela just didn't like this girl, or certainly not sufficiently, to be married to her. As a consequence of which, he bolted to Johannesburg.
Correct.
Now, had the chief presented him to some young girl who he found delicious and lovable and whatever, the whole history of this country would be completely different. And then just to continue, he arrived in Johannesburg. And he was looking for a little place to live in Alexandria.
And it's a job.
Yeah, but he was going to do some kind of legal stuff. But he needed a little place to live in Alexandria. So he hears there's a few estate agents, you know, probably a rather grandiose term for what they had in those days in the 1930s. And the estate agent he happened to go to, by sheer chance, was Walter Sisulu. Right? And Walter Sisulu is a person who said, "Hello, I like the look of this boy. He's the kind of leadership material we're looking for in the movement." And he basically recruited. Had he gone to some other estate agent who didn't give a damn, then, you know.
Because as it happens at that time, this is a very significant story actually. Walter Sisulu was the fixer.
Yes.
The man about town. He could find you a night guard job, whatever, if you were coming from rural Eastern Cape.
That's right.
Sisulu was the guy you went to see in Johannesburg.
Yeah.
And what Sisulu told me this story once on his porch, front porch in Soweto. He said at that time, the ANC had kind of fallen into the doldrums. All their old tried tactic of raising petitions and going to the authorities had proved ineffectual. And they wanted to raise the heat a bit and hijack the party from the conservative old guard that was running it. So they wanted to create the ANC Youth League and hope that the infusion of young energy will somewhat comparatively radicalize the party and make more demands. So they didn't know who would help them build this youth league. And he said when Mandela he was walking across towards his home in Soweto trying to look for a job or some other thing, or the house, and he says to himself, "That's the boy we need." Yeah. It was just pure instinct.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So this is an interesting thing. And then he went to start the youth league, and when they needed to start MK, then he was assigned to, start the armed wing of the ANC and so on and so forth. So this becomes a reinforcement, I think, for your central theory, for which I am completely biased, but perhaps David Pilling has a different view, hence raised his hand.
Thank you. So this conversation really resonates with me. So Machiavelli said luck was 50%. You two seem to have agreed on 95. I want to raise you So I'm going to say 100%. So as a young kid, I used to wander around in my kind of stupid young kid way of, I have not really grown up since then particularly. And I used to think, well, look, there's this, nature versus nurture. There's environment versus genes. So what percentage comes from whatever. But let's agree, that it's some combination of those two. What control does anyone have over either of those? You don't control your genes that you're born with. You have no control over those. You don't control your environment if you extend your environment to all the things that happen to you, not only at birth, but subsequently, all that chance, etc. So I want to know what room is there for free will, because I actually don't see any.
You asked the priest this morning. Why didn't you ask them? Do we look like priests to him?
I raised my hand, but I didn't have the good luck to be picked. And this is something that genuinely worries me.
Yes.
Nor do I think that this means that the answer is you float around on your lilo and wait for something to happen.
Right.
You have to act as though free will does exist.
Right.
But I don't see any evidence for it.
I know. No, I'm troubled by the same thought. I mean, I think if you really pursue it, the thought to its logical conclusions, free will. But I mean, I think the thing that I would hope we can all agree on is that we don't exert much control, and our great successes and achievements, we should all treat them with a very large dose of humility. As a lady was saying, the particular quintile in which you happen to be born, that's the really sort of decisive thing, and so few people emerge out of it, however genetically much more talented they might be than you or me or any of us, but there they are living in the bloody shack in Khayelitsha, and therefore let's use that as a means of trying to help that person in Khayelitsha.
Thank you, John. It's my great good luck to have been your friend for 31 years. John Carlin. We can break for coffee for 15 minutes. Thank you.
but feel free to interject.
I will just sit here. And this is yours. Welcome back. I assure you that no bad word will be said from this stage with these two, but they might find a way to provide you with additional laughs. We hope. Gloria Serobe and Enthoven helped to manage a significant social intervention in this country as the pandemic descended. And the resultant fund that was created, first sparked by the wealthiest families, but then with everybody really jumping in at various levels, was called the National Solidarity Fund, which gave cash directly to efforts to contain the pandemic and to provide emergency relief for a lot of distressed families. It was a moment, I would go so far as to say, rekindled the sense of solidarity, shall we say, in the country for one brief shining moment that people felt that they were pulling together again. And I was always interested in getting the two of you to talk about your experience of that time. I remember being locked down in our fair valley of Banhook, just on the other side of the mountains you see here. It was not the worst place in the world to be locked down, let's put it that way. Surrounded as I was by many winemaker friends, and when the government banned any sale of alcohol, we had no clue that there was even such a ban because cases of wine mysteriously appeared at my front door. But I say this to contrast the experience of millions of South Africans who were in really desperate straits at this time, and there was a lot of suffering. Ill fared the land. And these two old friends of mine, it is my luck to say, because it gave me bragging rights, led this extraordinary effort to try and pull the country together at a moment of extreme pain for so many millions. And I think it is worth us looking backward to what led us to that, what impact it had, and quite miraculously, for something set up never goes away, they wound it down once its job was done, which in a way is quite an achievement in itself. But what did we learn from that experience, and what can we take from it going forward to what might be the inevitable and potentially worse next pandemic, which the next panel will scare the bejesus out of us into preparing for, because they will at least try to get us to understand the road ahead. So we first look back in order to look ahead. Gloria.
Thanks, Dele. What is that? FOD, no? My name is Gloria Serobe. I think back to luck a little bit. How unlucky we are with your weather.
Yes, I was lucky about that. I will be the first to admit.
I had a beautiful dress to wear, and then I find this Stellenbosch like this. Now I'm covered in coats and blankets, and that's bad luck, right? November 2019 was the first COVID case in the world, and that was in China. And then 3 months later, We had our first COVID case on the 5th of March, 2020. In that 3 months, from November to March, we watched, especially Spain and Italy, going through all manner of turmoil. And incidentally, our first COVID patient actually had come from Italy. And we actually saw something that is truly, truly unmanageable. This is the one time I have to say that between our government and business and society and labor, they were very fast to meet and decide what to do on the 15th of March. I'm giving these dates to show the speed at which everything was done. They then decided that the Solidarity Fund must be formed, and it is meant to be a rapid response to augment the work of government and be given the crisis nature of what was supposed to be done. And largely led by private sector people, business, because government is doing what they are doing on the side. But in there was complete respect and humility between business and government and society and the community, because the country felt under siege. We felt under serious attack. And so from the 15th, I'm carrying on with my Sunday, reading for serious people. I hope Monty is not here. I wasn't reading City Press. I was reading Sunday World. Because that's my Sunday, how it looks like. Then I go back to the serious papers. I'm busy with this. I'm wearing my pajamas because it's Sunday. I'm in my house. And a phone call came from the president with the charming thing about, and when he has to charm me, he won't call me Gloria. He will use tomato. That's my second name. To say he would like me to chair the Solidarity Fund. They have made that decision between as network and as business and society and labor. And the person who will deputize for me is Enthoven. I said, President, I still have to think about that, but I don't know this guy. And from what it looks, I'm going to war with somebody I do not know. It's a big battle. But he said, Enthoven. I said, oh, okay, because of my age, I'm 64. The person I know is his father. He's a good man. He comes from a good family. So without knowing him, I will go to battle with him, because his background is a good family background. That's how you passed. May his soul rest in peace. We never had the chance to thank him enough for providing us with Eddie as a son and release him from many things. Pardon? I'm saying how lucky. Very lucky. We were very, very lucky. And so this is 22nd of March. By 29th of March, the full board was formed. I'm trying to stress the issue of the crisis, that decisions had to be made, and without fail. 29th of March, a board has been formed, and the formation of the board was very critical. It had to be a board of highly accomplished people who have everything to lose in terms of their reputation, and if there is corruption, or they cannot be associated with a mediocre. I won't go through the names, but we got the top people in the country to agree to serve in this board. So that was the 29th of March. Within a month, everything was put together, the resource mobilization, all of that. But just to say one last thing before Eddie comes in, because we'll have these conversations. The last point was that now that you have a credible board, it was very important that the governance processes have got to be right. Crisis has a way of creating chaos because everything is done under emergency and all of that. And for us, it was critical because we were now presiding over people's monies who were very desperate. They felt in trouble, and they were trusting us with their resources and the last piece of money. And so we needed to be clean, as in like very clean. And so those governance processes were very important. But to make sure that the governance processes don't hold back the work itself, it meant, one, the board must meet every week because some delegations of authority are sitting with the board. It meant that the subcommittees of the board, which were 3 of them, the fundraising committee, the disbursement committee, and the audit and risk committee, must also meet every week before the board. But what that meant is that the executive needed to meet every day. And me and Eddie, we were like the executive. And this meeting had to happen 7 a.m. to 9:30 every day. And that's what we did for at least 2 years, to make sure that we fit all the sequence of events. So the executive will meet in the war room from 7 to 9:30. From there, it goes to the subcommittees of the board, and then from there it goes to the board meeting, which meets every week on Thursday night to actually make the decision. That's the nature of the crisis. That's how we dealt with it. I would love to leave it there, Eddie, to just say that at least we have the sequence now of what made it work for us. But tactically, exactly what did we do? Maybe then let me just leave that for you.
Thanks, Gloria.
Thank you.
I mean, we don't often get kind of opportunities like this. So, Gloria and I are often sort of seen as the people who were there at the start. But actually, the person who really was the beginning of the fund is Martin Kingston, who's here with us today. Without Martin, there would have been no Solidarity Fund. It was conceptualized by Martin, and then together with Minister Patel, they were the ones who kind of imagined this and kind of set it in motion. And I would just like to kind of pay tribute to Martin. I mean, he's really one of the real kind of unsung heroes of the South Africa's fight against COVID. Not only was he in every single Solidarity Fund meeting, even though he was not a board member, he was not a formal executive committee member, but he also drove the business response in B4SA, mobilized the business community behind the vaccine program. And it's just such a great example. One of the things that we often spoke about at the fund was the spirit of radical generosity that we saw in South Africans. The fund raised over 4 billion rand. It was the largest mobilization of private funding South Africa had ever seen. Over 3,000 companies and foundations donated money, over 300,000 individuals from across the country. The Free State being the highest number of individual donors. It was the Free State or the Northwest, I can't remember. We had over 300 individuals working full-time pro bono for the fund at different times. And so, I mean, Martin kind of embodies what is just manifest in so many people who contributed to the fund. And we've got Rick Mennel, Leila Davids here today. It was an extraordinary effort. I mean, there wasn't a single company or individual that we approached who did not offer free support. And that was one of the kind of key aspects of the fund, was that we could operate in a completely frictionless way. Not a single cent went to consultants or salaries or board fees.
Thank God.
Yeah. So we were able to direct all the funding to try to have the biggest kind of impact that we could have. I mean, it'll be good, I think, we just have to be careful of time to get onto kind of what the key lessons were. But, I mean, the speed at which we were able to, I mean, essentially the idea of the fund, and I think this is important, was to be an independent vehicle, so independent both of business and of government. but to be able to help to complement and accelerate the national plan that was led by the Department of Health. So the idea was not to create another national response to the pandemic, was to say there is a national response. Our role is to complement and augment this with a highly agile, well-resourced, rapid response vehicle that could essentially kind of fill the gaps, and that's what we did. You know, we didn't have the resources of the state, but we could act much faster, we could be much more responsive, we could mobilize resources in the way that they couldn't do. We could bring, you know, one of the, I think, great lessons from the Solidarity Fund is that not only is there like such deep commitment to this country among citizens of this country and organizations in this country. I mean, I think we hugely underestimate, if you're able to mobilize, which is what we saw during COVID, and it wasn't just the Solidarity Fund. I mean, you saw these community action networks around the country. I mean, communities just organizing, businesses just organizing to help. And individuals. I mean, just extraordinary acts of generosity. And I think, you know, the big question is how, you know, how does one mobilize that for the challenges that we face today, which, you know, hopefully we'll get onto, but I think there's a real opportunity for that. But really, essentially, what the Solidarity Fund was able to do was to access the deep wells of capacity in society that exist to solve the problems that we face. And so there are particular problems that government is well suited to address, but there are particular problems where the private sector is actually in a much better, stronger position to tackle those problems and at speed. And what we found in the crisis was that there are a number of problems where civil society is much better than business or government in our humanitarian response, dealing with gender-based violence, dealing with hunger and food security. So, you know, mobilizing civil society to address those problems was by far the most. I mean, that's where capacity in society existed to address those problems.
Okay, thank you, thank you, Gloria. I was wondering. What symbolically the forming of that fund and the speed with which it moved and the extraordinary capital that it was able to mobilize in a very short time across the entire society, what symbolically do you think it meant for the country, particularly given the default position of seeming division and, shall we say, lack of solidarity?
What it did, and we also realized when Pricewaterhouse was doing our audit, when they actually confirmed that our audit is the most unique in the world, and it had to be done from London because the senior partners want to make sure that, because it will be an audit of a reference for the world for something like that. That was because nowhere else in the world has that happened, where business and government and civil society get into that and make it work. Remember that we're also saying that business and government, both of them are slow. They have their own processes there. In this case, everybody was agile. The decision-making was not held back. So that becomes a big symbol that it can be made to work, that government and business and civil society and labor can actually work together and make it work. We have seen it in South Africa pre-1990. There was an element of holding hands. It was the first time, I think, again, where we saw that kind of holding hands, enforcing and making work for South Africa. You also get into the point where you may be saying, South Africa have got to be under pressure first before they can do this and hold hands and make something work, because they are capable of doing that. So symbolically for me, that was one. Number two, I'm stressing again on the fact that there is emergency does not mean there must be loopholes. Does not mean that there must be gaps. You can actually, within that emergency situation, and actually force governance processes without holding back the activity. then our formula was that we have to meet frequently because everyone who has delegations of authority has ticked the box. We don't have the excuse about it. We had to make the decision because people are dying, but the board was only going to meet next week. We couldn't do that. And so the meeting weekly was meant to deal with that part of it, very critical. So for me, symbolically, it is those two things, that they can work together as partners and they can work with a lot of measures.
Right. So, Adi, I wanted to address another aspect of this symbolism. So it wasn't for a lack of good reason that the French Revolution had liberté, égalité, and fraternité. The fraternité part was what you guys were doing, and I thought that the point I was kind of making was how symbolically the country, particularly people who felt to themselves to be at the bottom of the well, felt that they were seen because all of the country's resources, all of its power was mobilized in order to care for people and keep them safe and healthy and fed. Now, that sense of solidarity in society which is needed for progress, how did you think that manifested from your experience of going through the period of the pandemic when you were running the fund?
I mean, it was our first meeting with the president. He had this kind of very interesting anecdote that he told us, which I think kind of partially answers your question. He said, you know, when the virus broke out in South Africa, he said it was like being in a classroom, and everyone in the classroom sees a snake, and the immediate response is like, we need to get out of the classroom.
Flight.
You know, exactly. And so everyone. There's no disagreement. Everyone kind of, and now everyone is like on the outside. Now they're looking through the window, and some people say like, well, maybe the snake's not there, or maybe we didn't see the snake, or maybe the snake's gone. Like maybe we should go in, maybe we should stay out. And the point is, like, at the moment of like the severe crisis, you are able to get that absolute kind of uniformity, that focus and that solidarity and that. I mean, it manifested in a different way as the pandemic progressed. But you know, one of the things that we kind of really experienced is that there's such a deep level of mistrust in this society. I mean, it was fascinating. You know, we had 2 government ministers on our board, and you know, one of the things that was really surprising to me is just how functional our board was and how brilliant these ministers were. I mean, Minister Patel in particular was an extraordinary board member. I mean, he had read every single page of every pack. He asked good questions. He never interfered in an inappropriate way. But there was this kind of public perception, if you've got government ministers on your board, this thing must be corrupt. Like there's no other possibility here. And not only do you have government ministers on your board, but you're buying PPE. You know, these two things when put together, you know, but dealing with that kind of mistrust was a huge challenge that we had to try to overcome. But there is something, I think, in, I mean, what I mentioned in the beginning, I think there's such a deep well of determination of South Africans for the country to succeed, and will and desire for the country to succeed. And I don't think it's that difficult to tap into that well. I just don't think we do it. And some of the things that Michael was talking about yesterday, and it's just, you know, what are the ways that we can kind of unlock this just massive potential that just sits below the surface there, not only of the country, but of the deep capacity, resource, will, commitment to making this country work that exists.
Thank you. So, what's stopping us from applying this model to all the other big challenges the country faces? Some of them more intractable, more difficult, and I would argue some of a more emergency nature even. Jobs being like one of those, right?
I mean, maybe I can start with that, because actually we've used the Martin seems to have disappeared now, but we've used the model of the Solidarity Fund. Rick Mennel and I and Martin have been very involved, but led by Martin, to think about how we use this to address some of the other critical, not the ones that you mentioned, but the 3 and many of those here today who are South African would have seen a lot of coverage about the 3 focus areas that business and government are working on together. The energy crisis, ending load shedding, the logistics crisis, in particular freight and ports, freight rail and ports, and the third is crime and corruption. And we've set up a fund that's very similar to the Solidarity Fund, called the Resource Mobilization Fund, which has now recruited and seconded capacity into the state to address some of these things. And we have a very similar to how we operated in the Solidarity Fund, we are now operating with the presidency around these 3 critical issues. We have teams that have been mobilized into Eskom, into Transnet, into trying to address some of the specific challenges that are being faced, driving the whole kind of reform agenda in those 2 areas. Obviously, in energy, it's behind the Energy Action Plan. It's not at the scale and at the intensity that the fund operated, but I think that all the ingredients are there, I think, to kind of scale up what we're doing there to do something very similar to what we did with the fund to address those 3 particular issues.
Okay. Thank you. So, Gloria.
I think what Ed is saying here is that load shedding, the logistics problem, hits everybody the same way. That's what worked with COVID, that COVID had no discrimination. It dealt with the rich ones, the poor ones, the rural, the urban, the blacks, the white, the male. Everybody was in trouble. And because of that, everybody wanted to solve it. I think the electricity thing, everybody wants to solve it. And there is an element of the logistics thing, even though it's visibly with the big guys transporting things or the ports, it is translating to our own tension. And I think those 2 things are going to be solved by South Africans because both of them are that snake. That somebody
in that classroom.
Yeah, there's an electricity snake and there is a logistics snake. I'm saying that because the reason COVID worked was because we were not second guessing each other about do we want to solve it or not. We were all in trouble and we had to do it. All our families were troubled. And so we had to be honest about what needs to be done. One of the things, Dele, is that, for example, COVID exposed the differences in South Africa in terms of people in the rural areas wouldn't have access to what is simple, as in testing or as in masks and stuff like that. And so, whereas in Sentin, they could just go to Discam and get whatever they want to get, in the rural areas, they have to get a taxi, pay 300 rands, go to East London to get a testing. Already, you have the inequality thing already on the plate. So, as a COVID team, as a Solidarity Fund team, we had to take testing and things to them. We had to be the ones crossing those bridges and rivers to make sure that they've got the same kind of access. You have a part of South Africa which is not accessible because it's along the railway lines, for example. How people had to go there. No port, GR, and those kinds of places. You had to take testing and everything to them. And for that, for example, we partner with a Transnet, a health train. And we negotiate for them to convert it into a testing train so that anyone along the rails, whether you're going to Pongola in KZN, or you're going to Limpopo, you're going to Northern Cape, wherever there's a railway track, that testing facility will be available. Those are the kinds of partnerships that you had to make. And so I think electricity is going to be solved.
Okay.
But thanks God, at some stage during the Solidarity Fund, somebody called and said, can you do the load shedding?
That Thank you. I wanted to ask one final thing before I turn it over to the audience. Were you surprised, Eddie, you were alluding to a certain number, the degrees of participation. Were you surprised that very large numbers of ordinary people, presumably without a lot of means, were so eager to donate the little they had to that fund? I'm surprised by the region that you mentioned, that it wouldn't immediately occur to you that either the Free State or Limpopo or something might send in the highest number of participants. We would normally think of Cape Town and Johannesburg, right? What do you think accounted for that? Was it a surprise?
I mean, firstly, just to talk about the range, and I mean, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, you know, the most important, largest factor that enabled us to move so quickly was the donation of Mary Oppenheim and her daughters. They gave R1 billion. They did that within a week, and the amount was dispersed within a week. And that enabled us to move as quickly as we did, and it created this kind of wave of confidence amongst many businesses and others. But you know, to take a gamble on an untested, a new organization, untested organization, is just like an incredible, again, act of generosity. And then we always used to speak at the fund, you know, from there to the people that were giving R1 or R2 or R5. I mean, people were collecting their social grant and coming and making a R2 or R5 or R10 donation to the Solidarity Fund. And that in equal measure for us, kind of led to this enormous like sense of responsibility, you know, to these people, to make sure that the money that they had entrusted to us, you know, that was just so valuable for them, that we got the most mileage from that money possible. But it was an extraordinary response, and I mean, I think it was one of the things about the fund was that, and I mean, something very much pushed by Gloria, is that it wasn't just an urban, you know, something amongst the kind of intelligentsia. I mean, our first behavioral change campaign, we were in 12 languages, in the 11 official languages, plus, I'm not going to pronounce this incorrectly, but is it? In the Northern Cape. So we were in every community radio station across the country. We had 30 to 60 minute slots every single day with doctors, local leaders discussing the pandemic, discussing the issues, how people should respond if they got ill. And that campaign reached every single South African across the country. And so we were in every house across the country talking about the pandemic. And so it was a brand, and it was a movement and a campaign that everyone felt connected to. And I think that was something very unusual and powerful about the fund.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask you now to indicate if you'd like to make a brief comment or ask any of our guests a question. Bulelani.
Just the first thing I wanted to ask, I think you have addressed already, was the role that the billionaires played in the Solidarity Fund. But on a serious note, how did you manage to ensure that the funds that were donated to you were not misused? How did you avoid the issue of corruption?
She was describing that.
Okay. I think as Eddie says, the burden of that trust from people giving you their money, small or big, puts a load on you in terms of we've got to do right at all costs. The sense of betrayal that can come from any leakage, we will not be able to recover from that. And I think the second thing is that the board that we put in place, their reputations were at stake in terms of they cannot be associated with their legacies. If you look at Professor Michael Katz, he's at the end of his legal career. He can't afford, at this point, to have the leakage of that nature. Sizwe, Masana, same thing. So the people who were in that board had everything to lose if something went wrong, which then means that the oversight had to be more than normal with our executives. And so we ended up being like executives, even though we were both non-executive chairmen and so on. You have the executives. Most importantly, they also were not being paid. They were all pro bono. Sacrificing, giving. So you had everybody around you sacrificing, giving of their best to make it work. And so the idea that you can leave that loose and not manage and not have corruption was something that kept us up all night. Because there was always an opportunity for that. But we had to be much more micro, actually, in terms of even who we buy from who and how, as difficult it was. So the masks, you could only get them from China because we don't use masks. We had to be detailed about that. The pricing, whether it's FOB or CIP, we were like management accountants and not your usual board. We had to be detailed. When it came to whether it's transportation costs or even Eddie knew more about the media planned work. You remember I used to be shocked with the size now of money going to radios. I didn't understand that. So all of that, we had to do the right thing because we had the burden of trust from all our funders. Political parties also put money into foreign governments, also put money. I think the one last thing I wanted to say is that to pressure ourselves from not being able to commit that, we promised reporting every week. Every week we were in the public platforms talking about how much we received, how much we dispersed, and with which supplier, and all of that. Our website was so detailed that those who had a team to look at things could actually go there. So we did cover ourselves with the process itself, but I think more than anything else, we did cover ourselves with people who had everything to lose, had something gone wrong. But
I mean, just a brief kind of addition to that. I mean, I think the biggest risk for that was in the PPE procurement in the early days because it was just chaos. I mean, prices were moving every day. You were just trying to get whatever stock you could get your hands on. Most of it was coming through intermediaries, so you had no idea what kind of margins the intermediaries were charging. So we were doing our best to secure the stock because you're sitting with a situation where you knew you were going to, I mean, at that stage, the crisis hadn't actually hit us yet, but you knew this thing was coming. And you had like an army that had no protection. They were going into battle with no protection. And it's like, you know, we need to get frontline health workers with PPE as soon as possible, and there's no way that the government's going to be able to respond in time. So we were having to procure as quickly as we could. I think what was different for us is that we assembled a group of private sector experienced procurement professionals out of the private sector who were volunteers in the procurement process, and we had as rigorous a process as we could. And I think what happened is actually initially all government procurement was going to come through the same procurement hub as we were procuring through the private sector, the mobilization of this private sector.
That didn't quite work out as intended.
And that changed. And when they decided to, loosen the public sector procurement rules in relation to PPE, that's when kind of havoc broke out. But I mean, I think Gloria's right. It was just, look, having said that, you could never absolutely guarantee this. I mean, we provided funding to hundreds of NGOs. I mean, there were so many different contracts that we entered into. We could just do the best that we could. We also knew that you just needed one event. That would just be the end of the Solidarity Fund. You know, just because of the low levels of public trust, people wouldn't just say, like, you made a mistake there. It would be like, that's... So we were, we were very diligent, but we were also lucky.
Thank you. See? You got lucky. Okay, here.
I would like to thank both of you for the incredible work you did to keep us all alive during that period. And then I hear that, how do we take this kind of model forward? And Madam Gloria suggested the serpent of ESCOM, which affects everybody. That the response for COVID was because it affected everybody. Everybody was at risk. But I hear, since yesterday in this space, that there has to be something that will begin with the most vulnerable in the society. And if we take it to that level, that may not be everybody, like ESCOM situation. So the lady who talked to us yesterday about child malnutrition, that's not something that affects everybody, but that's something that affects the most vulnerable in the society. So I'm wondering, how can this kind of model help us to tackle those smaller snakes, the green snakes under the green grass? For instance, I'll put that in context. My church is newly located in an environment that has a township just behind us. And so during the week, children get free lunch in school. But at weekends, now, many of those children in the location, there is no food. On Friday, some of us, on Saturday, we went from church into the, yes, I'm putting it in context, into the location. And you find children who have not eaten anything that day at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So how can this solidarity fund help us with the kind of factories that bring food for children into our communities to ensure that the most vulnerable are taken care of and not just things that concern everybody? Thank you.
I think one of the things we learned during the COVID crisis that I think kind of applies to your question and is certainly kind of uppermost in the thinking of those of us who are involved in energy and some of these other crises now is one of the mistakes we've made in the past in South Africa, it feels to me, is that there are hundreds of crises we're trying to solve simultaneously. And attention is spread over so many different areas. And one of the big lessons of the COVID crisis is that when all the attention is focused on one thing, the opportunity for the scale of impact is just unimaginable, actually. And so the challenge, I think, is how do you kind of focus the attention of society and of the kind of major, powerful role players in society on a particular issue or one or two particular issues. Now, in relation to this kind of process with the president, there are 3 issues that have been chosen. But let's take something like hunger or malnutrition as something. Is the challenge there, the first and most important challenge is to try to get alignment that this is the most important problem to solve. Because the challenge is like you as you kind of raise that, someone else is saying, but I think gender-based violence is a more, that is the thing that really, we should be focused on. And someone else says, well, if we're not educating our children, or 2/3 of young people are not in work or marginalized from the formal economy, they're there. And this is the problem, is that we then have this kind of, smorgasbord of issues, and attention gets drawn across all of these things. And I think we need to just decide on one or two things like, and I think there's an incredibly compelling case for hunger and malnutrition to be one of them, but to choose something like that and to kind of focus on it and to get philanthropists and business and civil society and government aligned around practical plans to deal with. The other thing that's really important that we're learning in energy and logistics is that there has to be a plan, a concrete plan that has the buy-in of everybody. And and a detailed plan. And one of the problems with the plans in the past is that there were just too many things in the plan. But if you look at the energy action plan, it's highly detailed, it's highly specific. We know what we need to do, there are clear milestones. It's much easier to mobilize resources and energy behind that. But you would need something like that for something like hunger or malnutrition. You would need a plan that everyone can get behind, so we understand practically what is it going to mean to solve this problem.
Well, I'd like to thank you both. We've sort of run out of our allotted time. Thank you for reminding us of the magic that's possible when we apply our minds to it.
Thank you.
Tulio and Laurie, it's all yours.
I want to thank Gloria for giving me the excuse. I also decided to go warm instead of stylish. Good afternoon. I got to get booted up here. So, we're gonna blow your mind, and I think by the end, hopefully, by the time we hit our 45-minute mark, you will understand that there's a revolution underway. It's already started, and amazingly, Africa may be the key player. It's possible in science in a way that has not been a possibility in the past. So, just boot up here.
Yeah, no pressure.
No pressure. So we're going to be, every single one of you, probably right at this moment, has some sort of binomial device on you or in your bag. And you're quite accustomed to the idea of 1, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 1, 0. And you can see that just with 2, you can have things as complex as artificial intelligence and upcoming, quantum computing. But we're going to be talking to you about quadrinomial, A, C, T, G, and in the case of RNA, U. And to do that, it's Laurie Garrett come to you from Brooklyn, and Dr. Tulio de Oliveira come to you from Stellenbosch. And we're going to try to walk you through a pretty exciting series of things coming up. First of all, DNA and RNA, the essence of life. We first really get to deep understanding with the Human Genome Project, which set out to do the genetic sequence of an entire human genome, all the chromosomes, etc. It took 13 years. It was completed in 2003 at a cost of $2.7 billion. It had involved more than 60 laboratories around the world. And it was, a giant breakthrough at the time. But actually right now you can buy a kit online for $200 and sequence your genome in your kitchen. So Moore's law has been defied many times over in biology. We've gone from 2.7 billion to 200, and everybody knows it's going to keep coming down in cost. And what this means is that we have a technology that allows us to search into the biological world in a way that was never really truly possible before. When I was a grad student, isolating a gene was what you would get a PhD for. I'm ancient, but not that ancient. And it would take, 2-3 years of hard work. And today, high school students compete in an international competition, high school and college kids, called iGEM. And the competition requires that you create as a team a new life form. A new life form. You genetically modify or create something entirely new. And the things kids come up with, you wouldn't believe. So we've got price point down, we've got technology that makes all this possible and makes it possible for us to peer into the biological world in new ways. It's revolutionizing everything, and it's making the questions bigger. It's making us take on challenges that would have seemed formidable not long ago. And COVID, the pandemic, pushed it yet further and at lightning speed. And suddenly you had laboratories all over the world sequencing COVID viruses and posting their sequences on open source places, 2 key ones, one called GISAID and one called GenBank. And it was as if all of a sudden all sorts of rules of the past evaporated, like you couldn't patent your sequence. You put it out for everybody to have access to. And also revolutionized was getting into looking at wastewater analysis, realizing might not be able to test every person, but you can test the effluence of every person and see if COVID is in the community, if new strains have emerged. Suddenly we could see if animals had a virus that could infect us in a form of COVID, or were we giving it to our pets, our livestock, animals in the environment. And as you think bigger beyond COVID, you realize anything can be sequenced. You can look at mosquitoes, you can look at the oceans, you can begin to think about what might be crawling around on your food, and suddenly your world goes boom. And the most exciting thing is that right down the road from us is the Center for Epidemic Response and Innovation, which, may I call you Tulio?
Yes, of course.
Which Tulio runs. And you couldn't ask for a more exciting director. Technically a Brazilian, but we'll talk about what that is about. And a South African, and an African, and a man of the world. He's won so many scientific awards, is so widely respected in the scientific world, well off this continent, that we don't have time here to detail all his achievements and why he is so lauded. He did crucial study at University of KwaZulu-Natal. He spent a lot of his life in Durban, but he's also lived many places around the world and brought all that experience right here to Stellenbosch, having published about 300 major scientific papers in less than 30 years, and many of them in the most prestigious scientific journals in the world. So let's take a quick time machine walk to bring the crowd up to speed here. In the 1990s, you started off working mostly on HIV, HTLV, which is a virus you haven't heard of, but don't worry about it, and a category of microbes called endogenous retroviruses, which HIV is one of. And these are these bizarre, before HIV, didn't even think they really existed, organisms that are made of RNA and are capable of getting into making a reverse copy of themselves and going into your DNA and actually infecting your DNA. So when the key lesson that you think just takes you on your journey to where you are now, that you got out of HIV was what?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I should contract Laurie to do my introductions. Yeah. Yeah. So, and that's something that a lot of people don't realize. Yeah. South Africa is a great place, yeah, to do that. Brazil or South Asia. I think that we have a much longer term dealing with epidemics, and a lot of time dealing with very advanced technology that people were unaware. So the HIV pandemic, which is a pandemic, affect the whole world, yeah, it brought some of the biggest technology to South Africa. And that's where we build a lot of the resources to respond to other viruses, to other bacteria. So the HIV, which was a terrible thing that happened in South Africa, and many of you will remember in the late of the 90s, yeah, how people were just dying, and we have a government that did not believe on antiretrovirus. Sometimes you have this mad government. Yeah, she had one in her country very recently. Yeah, and in the end, the HIV, not only the research for me, but for many of the top scientists in South Africa, was what allow us to advance the technology, yeah, and bring some of the best labs in the world to the country.
Well, I should back up and say, you know, I mentioned that you're Brazilian, but you're not really. And so, to explain this, tell us who your mother was.
No. My mother was a freedom fighter from Mozambique. Yeah, she went basic to Brazil in exile. It was very dangerous. Yeah, and then when Mandela became the president, she decided to come back. Yeah. So because knew that the civil war would end up in Mozambique, and she went to work for the UN, and me and my sisters went to Durban because you can drive to Maputo and it's much nicer than Johannesburg. Yeah.
But I think maybe because of that legacy or whatever, you have a certain kind of impulse to look at the political problems or political dimensions of scientific issues, because one really important campaign you took on is the Benghazi 6, which probably nobody in this room has heard of, but you were very insistent that the Libyan government had to pay a price for falsely accusing 5 Bulgarian nurses and 1 Palestinian physician of deliberately infecting children with HIV in Libya. What was the core issue you were upset about at that time?
So yeah, just in a minute or two. That was an extraordinary case. You had 418 children that were acquired HIV in a hospital in Libya. Libya is a Islamic country which normally do not have HIV, and they accused this foreign medical personnel of having purpose went and infected the children. And it's a terrible accusation especially for nurses and doctors, that the job is to save lives. Yeah, and they stayed 7 years in jail in terrible conditions, and they were condemned to death penalty. Yeah. When it was 6 weeks before the death penalty, they asked for help. That time I was in Oxford University, yeah. And what we did, we got access to the samples of the children. We could analyze the virus. They had multiple strains of hepatitis C and HIV. And then when we basically do a detective work, we can time the epidemic, and then it was very clear that they were innocent. That was a hospital infection problem running for years before they arrived. Yeah, luckily we could prove the innocence like within a couple of weeks before they be executed, and then
they were going to be executed.
Yes, and then we got a lot of help from the Nobel College. 114 Nobel Prize winners signed a letter trusting the results, and then a lot of the politicians got involved, and in the end they were freed. Yeah, and it was quite a great pleasure to
Well, warm it up because you're going to be clapping a lot. Flash forward 15 years, and we had this outbreak predominantly in gay men, sexually transmitted, of what was being called monkeypox. And once again, your outrage button got pushed. Why?
Yeah, so that's very recently. It's around like a few months ago. Yeah, and you may remember. I almost say last year. Yeah, that they have these awful outbreaks of what's called mpox, monkeypox virus, yeah, and that was happening in mostly European, men who have sex with men, yeah, but at the same time, all the pictures that they were using on the media, it was of African people, yeah. And they were highlighting this is another African disease, and they were talking about the West African clade and the Central African clade, and this is this virus that comes from monkeys. This virus do not come from monkeys, yeah, that affect the African people. Is the African people giving again another terrible disease to the world, yeah. And then we thought that was a very discriminative way to do that, and we managed to rally the scientific community, yeah. And we end up changing the name of the virus. The virus is called now mpox, yeah. And this geographical characterization of clades that discriminate communities is now out. We call mpox clade 1, 2, and 3, yeah.
He pushed WHO, the whole international community. And then you did a very tiny little effort. You discovered Omicron.
Yeah, we discovered more than Omicron. We also the ones that came with discover the first variants, yeah, and we helped the UK to discover what became the Alpha. They just published one day before, even that we had agreed, yeah, and we discovered the Beta, and we discovered the Omicron in very record time, and that was quite important, yeah, because we discovered Omicron before almost any case emerged in the country, and we could work with our government to prepare the hospitals, and we end up with very few deaths on the Omicron. And
unlike in the USA.
Yes, unlike in the USA, and we highlight the word, we identify with these very fast technologies, yeah, we identify in 2 days. We communicate. I talked so many times with our president that he would start the calls, oh, not you again, Tulio. And then communicate clear, and the response could prepare. And we highlighted this is a very transmissible lineage. Yeah, it will spread very fast. Yeah, and instead of they kind of taking serious our advice and preparing what they did with South Africa, they lock us on and punish with a travel ban and say like, oh, that's your problem, eh? And we highlighted very clear that it was unethical, yeah, and that would be ineffective, and the Omicron end up spreading all around the world, yeah, which again we have no proof that come to South Africa. We just could detect and act very well. And what we are worried is that if you keep punishing countries for discovering pathogens, yeah, what's going to happen easily are the pandemics, because they will be reluctant to highlight and sound the alarms. Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. You think of the punishment of a country for announcing we have discovered a microbe as being something that rich countries do to poor countries, which, you know, or poorer countries, which was the case with Omicron. But actually in H1N1 in 2009, that pandemic first emerged in the United States and then Mexico, and all over the world, flights from the United States were banned, and Americans were locked up at the airports and so on all across Asia. So it can go both ways. It just tends to more often go this way we're describing. Well, right now with the SARS-CoV-2 or COVID epidemic, we have several variants or mutated forms, evolving forms. Let me just back up and say, we're watching evolution in real time. COVID is not done. You might be done with it, but it's not done. It is still new to our species, and it is still feeling selection pressures and mutating and evolving. So right now we have the BA 2.75, the BA 2.68, the EG5 and the XBB strains all circulating. And there's various degrees of concern about them. Clearly there's new surges in hospitalization. I'm in a city where hospitalization is almost now at the level of the early stage of the Omicron outbreak, you know, a year and a half or 2 years ago. So what do you make of these specific strains? How concerned should we be?
I'm not concerned at all. We are alerted. We have very good genomic surveillance network. We have detected all these lineages in South Africa. We are still following the data. At the moment, South Africa has extremely high population immunity, yeah, and in the last 4 kind of mini waves, yeah, did not translate into hospitalization and deaths, yeah. And at the moment, I think that we move away from the pandemic phase of COVID, yeah, and we are more in a phase that we're gonna have infection, yeah, but will not translate in a very deadly phase. But we are quite sure that other viruses, not COVID, will come also. Yeah.
We're getting there.
Yeah.
One problem with trying to say where are we with these new variants and how dangerous is the situation is that so few countries are now reporting to WHO. It's dropped off to only 47 nations in the world submitting data on COVID to WHO. And many countries, in fact, I would say almost all nations, have eliminated the mandates for PCR testing, genetic testing to prove that you are or are not infected, with the result that most people are kind of figuring out they're infected just because they have a fever and what the heck, or they do a home test with a crude antigen test. And, you know, we just don't really know how well any of these tests perform, and where it leaves us with a lot of mystery in the epidemic today that we ironically didn't have a year and a half ago. We're in a less precise sense of it.
But South Africa was one of the few countries that maintained some big surveillance programs. Yeah, again, probably something that we have been doing for HIV and TB for decades. Yeah, and we have sentinel sites in 5 provinces. At least we can track in real time. And South Africa did become one of the main countries that is still helping the WHO to deal with the after effects of this pandemic. Yeah.
Earlier this week, I had the tremendous pleasure of spending time at your laboratory. I know when I say laboratory, you're all imagining a room about this size with a bunch of people huddled over microscopes. No. We're talking about a massive institute. What's the name of the town? What suburb is that in?
It's just by the Tygerberg Medical Campus.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, we just built a massive institute, one of the most advanced in the world, behind the second biggest hospital in South Africa, the Tygerberg Hospital, but also a very important hospital because that's the one that serves all the poor population of Cape Town. Yeah, so that make one of the best places to quickly identify and characterize new infections. Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to overplay, but I mean, this would be a state-of-the-art, cutting-edge facility anywhere in the world today. There are people all over my hometown of New York City that would give their eye teeth to have half of what you have. So, I mean, this is incredible, and it is independently funded, right? I mean, you're not dependent on any single source funding stream. You've come up with a fairly novel funding mechanism combination, yeah? You want to explain?
Yes. So this new institute, a big investment was the university itself. Yeah, they put like 1.2 billion rand on the table. Yeah, our government, we always force our government to fund ourselves, not because we need a lot of the money, but because then they feel invested and it's easier to give the results and drive a national agenda. The government also put around 300 million rand on that, yeah, and then we raise funding from many donors, yeah, such as the Rockefeller Foundation, the World Bank, the National Institute of Health, the European Commission. We just got an award today of 100 million rand from the European Commission. Yeah, yeah, private donors, high net individuals donating equipment. But why they are doing that? Yeah, it is because this is not just for South Africa or Stellenbosch. This is also the main training place for African fellows at the moment. Yeah, we managed to fund a big program. We got, in the last 3 years, during the pandemic, we brought 403 fellows from 49 African countries to spend weeks, months, or years with us, with the deal that they always go back, so we don't do brain drain, and then we support them to react to the epidemics in the country. Yeah.
And I think we need to go a little deeper on that because, you know, when I was first coming to this continent in the 1970s, you know, science was completely a one-way street. It was foreigners. We used to call it safari science. They would come in from Europe, the United States, Canada, Japan, wherever. They would corral some local smart African folks to be their assistants. They would conduct their research, and then they would leave, and they would publish the results and get all the glory, and the Africans wouldn't even have their names on the papers. And you're talking about a model where you're basically creating an infrastructure across the whole continent of skilled genomic research centers that can identify potential outbreaks before they really explode. And those people have equality with you. They are your peers. You are not their boss, etc. Explain.
Yes, why we are doing that? Because of course that they are the best ones to identify outbreaks and epidemics. Who is the best people to identify new virus epidemics? It's people that are in the clinic, that see the patients, that see the unusual case, that can process samples quick. Yeah. So we treat them as colleagues, yeah, because they are also independent from us, yeah. But we provide training, we provide a lot of time funding, we provide reagents when they need to respond. A little bit what the Solidarity did there. If you see a unusual epidemic, they can request to us, and we're going to ship them like the reagents that they need to characterize that in days. Yeah, it involves some logistics. Yeah, and why we are doing that? Because that's we think that's the most cost-effective way to do it. Because if you can quickly detect and characterize the outbreaks, and why with genomics? Because once you have the genome of the pathogen, yeah, that's what you use to design the diagnostics. That's what you use to design the therapeutics. That's what you use to design the vaccines, yeah. And that's why it's so important to become the cornerstone, yeah. And we also work with the WHO and the Africa CDC. We also opened the first training hub of mRNA vaccines in the world in South Africa, yeah. And that's to produce vaccines.
Wait, I don't know if everybody got that. mRNA vaccine production and design center here. Not wait for the outside world. Here, we're talking Africans protecting Africans, designing drugs, diagnostics, vaccines for Africa.
Yeah, no, but that's not my work. I'm part of the network that work on that. We identify and they act. Yeah, why that is because some of the pathogens there is no interest of the world to develop vaccine or therapeutics. Yeah, for example, the one that we worry a lot is Rift Valley fever. Yeah, which have pandemic potential, or chikungunya. Or that a lot of time people don't realize, but if you get serious infection of chikungunya, yeah, some people can never go back for manual labor. What's the effect that on a poor family? That the person cannot do manual labor. So maybe the world doesn't have interest now to develop that, yeah. So it has to be identified and developed here. But unfortunately, these epidemics will also arrive on the developed world, yeah.
And so your group identified cholera in Malawi, and this was a new strain, right?
Yeah, that's a sad story. Just happened a few months ago. Yeah, so They had a very big flood last year in Pakistan. I don't know if you remember, and they had a new strain that caused a big outbreak in Pakistan. Yeah, that was introduced to Malawi in the dry season, and then when started the floods in Malawi, yeah, it caused the most deadly cholera epidemic ever of the history of Malawi. Yeah. We are talking about like at least 2,000 recorded cases of deaths of Malawi, but completely destroyed the health system. And cholera is such a preventable epidemic, and just about not be prepared to respond quick. Yeah. But now, with this knowledge now, it is that when the epidemic happens, South Asia is likely to be introduced in Africa. 13 of the 13 cholera big outbreaks in Africa come from South Asia, and then to prepare that to respond. And that's what we're doing a lot with the WHO and the Africa CDC. Yeah.
And I'm cognizant that I'm running into the Q&A time, but there's a couple more points we really need to make here. What the cholera thing illustrated, and the increase in dengue in Senegal, and the huge dengue outbreak recently in Paraguay, the biggest in the history of the country, and we could go through a huge list. What we're seeing is climate change coming head on head with emerging diseases, so that it's, we heard a college student yesterday use the term polycrisis, and I don't think that the people on the panel understood the phrase, but this is polycrisis. It's one crisis synergistically worsening the other crisis. What do you see as the key threats here in Africa for climate change affecting pathogens?
It's really a big problem. So it's estimated that 60% of all the non-pathogens are being amplified by climate change. Yeah. So the majority of the pathogens, they are either vector, this means transmitted by mosquitoes or ticks. Yeah. I don't know about you, but I have mosquito net in Stellenbosch. It's quite ridiculous. Yeah. And the other ones are waterborne pathogens. So for example, that's caused a lot, I think that we are seeing floods everywhere. For example, in Durban, you cannot go to the sea because E. coli and cholera is associated with that. Yeah. And that is unfortunately happened very quick. As we, on our side, is that these epidemics are also affecting now Europe and United States. Yeah. So for example, we have big West Nile outbreaks and dengue and malaria in the United States. And that's a lot of times the only time that they take attention, yeah, because if it only affect Africa, Latin America, and Asia, there isn't not attention. But unfortunately, that's spreading everywhere.
And I'm going to go out on a limb and say my prediction, the microbe I'm most nervous about, and I'm watching very closely, which has been evolving fairly rapidly in the last 2 years and affecting a far broader range of species on the planet, including fellow mammals, is H5N1 influenza. And it's a form of influenza that, when it does infect humans, is extremely likely to be fatal, far more dangerous than the less than 2% fatality rate we see with COVID. I don't know if you are also a H5N1 watcher.
Yeah, we do sequence a lot of influenza here. At the moment, the H5N1, it is still many steps away from become adapted for human transmission. Yeah, but we are very careful about that. So when birds die, we will receive samples to see the strain. In Tigerberg, we have a big flu sentinel site. We are kind of alerted about that, but at the moment we are not concerned.
Okay. Well, he's more optimistic than I. We have a lightning round time for some questions. If I can get any, let's see if I see anyone. Here we go, David.
Hi, thanks very much. Fascinating. I'm very interested in the whole mRNA vaccine and this idea that that there was sort of plug and play. Once you can sequence the code of the virus, then you've got your answer and you can very quickly get a vaccine. I mean, this sounds almost too good to be true. It sounds like a miracle in the making. There's also talk, as you've hinted at or said here, of this being developed here on the continent. I mean, can this be wielded rapidly so that when you are able to detect something new pops up, then someone else goes away and makes a vaccine and problem solved? I mean, presumably it's not as simple as that, but what potential, what hope does this mRNA
Can I just
revolution bring?
add to that? Jeremy Farrar, who used to run the Wellcome Trust and is now the chief scientist at WHO, says our goal is to make it a 6-week process.
Yeah. So the mRNA is a revolutionary technology, yeah, and can be developed quick. And the ironic part, the problem is not in the technology, it's the access to the technology. Yeah. Many of the COVID vaccines were done on the strains that we detect and characterize. Yeah. But they also hard vaccines. We didn't have access to vaccines that were done with the strains that we identify. Yeah, that's the big problem, and that's why it's a big investment in South Africa with the medicine patents pool and the WHO on the mRNA hub. With the objective is not only make the vaccines here, but to do similar as we do with our genomics facility that become also the training center, so this technology can be transferred to other countries in the world. Yeah. And at the moment it is the fast technology that can go from sample to a viable vaccine. Yeah.
Another question? Right here.
Thank you. Two questions. The first one has to do directly with the subject matter. There's a growing concern around how the more powerful countries are using particular DNA sequencing around food and so on to limit availability of certain, food types or the ability to grow certain things and so on. Could you tell us more about that and whether it applies in the health sense to the extent where we're going to find ourselves having scenarios where someone has sequenced something somewhere and isn't willing to necessarily make it open source, and the risks that we have to that. And then secondly, Laurie, maybe you would be more familiar with this, but the viral nature, what can you tell or lift out of your observations? I mean, you've studied this a lot, but the viral nature of ideas and making them potent. From what you've seen in the microbe space, is there anything you can, lift out in terms of the virality of ideas and the potency thereof? Thanks.
You take the first one.
No. First you can take the second, and I take, yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, just quickly, I mean, we do talk immediately on social media. It went viral, right? That's the phrase. With every single epidemic I've ever been in, and I've been in now more than 40 around the world, there's always a conspiracy theory, every single time, at least one. In every single epidemic, there are lies, false stories, false cures. There's somebody trying to make a buck off of it by claiming what's in this bottle heals. And it is a supreme task of public health authorities to maintain sanity, if you will. And that is becoming harder and harder as information has more ways to flow and to flow more rapidly. And so at this point, I mean, you go on Twitter and you would think that, COVID was made by, and then you fill in the blank, dozens of different scenarios in which somebody manufactured it, or it leaked from, and now you fill in those blanks. Or it can be cured with, and fill in one ridiculous scenario, treatment after another, and so on and so forth. This is normal for all epidemics, but it has been so much worse with COVID that it's off the charts. And it's out of the control of most public health authorities. I was so impressed by what Aidan and Gloria described, because you had a credible primary source that was in direct communication with its counterpart in government. And so you had more consistent messaging. In most of the world, that was not the case at all. In most of the world, you had people giving equal credence to a stand-up comedian saying, what you should do, and a musician rock star compared to a scientist who had published hundreds of papers on the topic and was considered within the scientific community one of the great geniuses of the field. It's madness.
Yeah, but in South Africa, this did not happen. Why? Yeah, we were vaccinated. We had the same conspiracy theories before with HIV. Yeah, who doesn't remember? We even had a president that what was beetroot was great and no antiretroviral. So I think that we learned from that. Yeah, that a lot of time, just like try to not deal with a virus and an epidemic. Yeah, is not a good idea. It's not going to go away. Yeah, and it's better to take quite serious. Yeah, and to use more scientific. Because one thing that Laurie didn't believe is that how scientists, and many of you have seen me dozens of times on the TV, we are not hated by the public. Yeah, we can walk in the streets. Yeah, the opposite. Yeah,
not true in the USA.
Yeah, and I think that we learn, and that's why we think that here can be a big place that can protect the rest of the world there. By exactly investing in technology as a training center. And for us, the big problem now is the climate change and epidemics. Yeah, and that's why we're going to be tracking. And again, but now we invite like the dual cuckoos, the ones that don't believe in climate change and the ones that don't believe on epidemics. But I think that if we just ignore that, we're just going to have more and more epidemics and pandemics.
It's the famous cartoon of the frog sitting in the water and the pot keeps getting hotter and hotter until the frog boils. But because the increments of the rising heat are teeny bits at a time, the frog keeps sitting there. Well, now we add to it that the frog is coughing the whole time. And that doesn't seem to bother the frog either because, hey, all the other frogs in the pot are also coughing. So, polycrisis. And on that note, with our time out, I yield to Dele.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurie and Tulio, for an exceptionally intelligent and informative session. And we will now carry science over to art. In this case, music specifically, as we take all of you from here to the University Museum, about 10 minutes away, for Neil Muyanga's session on Amazing Grace. The buses are already waiting for you outside.